Perhaps you want to say screw C# or any other programming language because you want to learn and use C++. Perhaps you have the thoughts that C++ is the best language for game and application development based off the things you've read on the internet or from what you have heard other developers say. Maybe, just maybe, you have looked at job listings and noticed that C++ was the commonality for the programming language used in the AAA industry and have decided that is your dream, to work for the AAA games industry. Whatever your reasons are for wanting to learn C++ with game development, you still have to start the learning process. Hello, I'm Jesco. You're watching Game Dev Made Easy, and in today's video, we are going to discuss the main things any beginner to game development and to the C++ programming language should know and learn. This video is not going to be all-inclusive, nor is it going to teach you the fundamentals of the language. I will, however, go over some examples to illustrate my points and give some game engine suggestions for you to look into. I asked a very simple question over on Twitter in order to gain other developers' insights on the subject. After all, I want this to be a conversation where people can add their own thoughts to it. Again, these are just opinions on the subject, as opinions are like butts. Everyone has one and no butt is better than another's. The question I asked is as followed. C++ developers, what would you say are the main things any beginner to C++ should know prior to trying to jump into game development with C++? Nikita Lista, sorry if I butchered your name, said two things on the topic. 1. C++ is not the single best choice available for game dev. 2. It is a language entirely different from others. Not C with classes, not Java but faster, not anything like that. It has a unique spirit, which better be learned, understood, and appreciated. So let's break this down. Why is C++ not the single best choice available for game dev? The reason for this is due to the fact that it all boils down to what you want to target. For Android devices, the best choice would be Java, as that is the native language for the platform. iOS would be Swift or Objective-C, as both of these languages are native to that platform. It gets a bit murkier depending on other platforms, and is also dependent on the game engine you choose. For example, Unity uses C# as the scripting language, but compiles things down to C++ for you. CryEngine uses both C++ and C#. The C# side is not converted to C++ at compile time. Unreal Engine uses C++, Flat Red Ball uses C# with no conversion over to C++, Pygame uses Python, Cocos 2D is dependent on the language you are working with, JMonkey Engine uses Java, Phaser uses JavaScript and TypeScript with everything ending up being HTML5 compliant, the list goes on. Another point that would make C++ not the single best choice available for game dev is which programming language you and the team you are working with are most comfortable using. As we can see, it is ultimately determined by what you want to do and the choices you make for your libraries, frameworks, or game engines. Each language has their own pros and cons associated with them. The second part is, why is C++ entirely different from other languages? C++ was originally intended to be a superset of the C language, but ended up morphing and becoming a language of its own. C++ is different from C by many factors, not just classes. C++ has incorporated many different features that C does not have. Casting is much simpler and easier to read in C++ over C. Many C programmers will argue that C is easier than C++, but that isn't what is being discussed here. C++ has flexible declarations. You can mix data declarations with functions and executable statements. Structs and union tags are considered to be a type name. RAII and deterministic destruction. RAII is a general method of managing all resources with smart pointers. Operator overloading allows you to redefine the functionality of most built-in operators. Distinct reference type identifier with the @ symbol, with pointers being identified with the star symbol. C++ also has a powerful template system. This is extremely complex to talk about in a trivial manner, but I will try to showcase a good example when we get to showcasing it. C++ allows for multiple inheritance. This one is a doozy. Essentially, you can inherit from multiple parent classes in a single derived class. A very powerful feature, but it's also a double-edged sword. FlexFerrum says, beware of memory management and dangling pointers. Always keep in mind object ownership relations and lifetime scope. This is followed up by Grandmaster True, who says, this, and keep things separated. Design with data as first priority. Process it efficiently. Do not complicate simple things. Be sure you can always reason about functions and their cost. But that's nothing C++ specific. So, manage your memory, be explicit about it. The last person, Arne Mertz, says on this very same topic, in that regard, consider RAII classes. Example, smart pointers. Standard library or written for your own use case. They can make that task easier, but you still have to think about lifetime and ownership. Now, why do we need to be aware of memory management, dangling pointers, complication of simple things, and cost? Pointers and memory management go hand in hand. Pointers point to the direct address in memory for the objects you are dealing with. If you leave pointers dangling, they can and often do lead to memory leaks. Memory leaks essentially is a failure in the program to release discarded memory, which causes impaired performance or points where the program can fail. What about complicating simple things? Think about it like this. If you try to over-engineer a simple thing, then that will lead to you over-engineering more complex tasks. Take a look at this example of a hello world that is extremely over-engineered. There generally is no reason to do it like this when you can easily do it like this. This can have significant performance issues and mismanaged memory. Lastly, everything has a cost in software development, so knowing what is expensive or cheap to call is a godsend. It can and usually does circle back to performance. Tamir Bahar says two things as well. Becoming an expert in C++ is a long journey. Becoming productive is a far shorter one. Why is the road to becoming an expert a long journey? Well, it follows the overall mastering process. You need to put in a lot of work and time to becoming an expert in anything. It can be quite a few years before you can be an expert in anything, and that includes C++. I have been a programmer in C# for more than 8 years now, and I am by no means an expert. There is always something new to learn. Why is becoming productive a far shorter one? The journey from just starting to do anything to being productive doesn't mean that you are an expert by any means. You know enough to build things on your own without becoming lost. You have the grasp of the fundamentals and a few intermediate concepts. You can work and complete things without too many hiccups, along with being able to find an answer to problems you are facing without becoming lost. You understand what the code is saying when you look at examples and also understand why it works the way it does. What game engine should you look into learning that uses C++? Well, there's a giant list to choose from, so I will only talk about a few that I think are rather notable. Unreal Engine, CryEngine, Lumberyard, and Cocos 2D. All of these engines have their own pros and cons associated with them, along with vastly different workflows, so just keep that in mind when choosing an engine. Just because you learned one game engine doesn't mean that those skills will translate with the 1-to-1 ratio to the next engine. Next up, in the CryEngine Discord server, I asked a few questions to be answered for beginners to C++ and CryEngine. Those questions were, what would you say are the most important things for someone getting started with CryEngine and our beginners to C++ should know prior to looking at the C++ documentation or the example code provided? Alternatively, what is the level of C++ knowledge someone should have when beginning C++ development with CryEngine? And the last question is, do you think that any C++ knowledge is required if you wanted to use Flowcraft in any capacity with the engine? If yes, are there any docs for how to expose, say, entity to Flowgraph in very simple terms? First, I asked Josh these questions, and his answer was, honestly, if you understand pointers, you're good to go normally to get started. Maybe just make a 3D Pong or something that teaches the important basics. Josh went with a more simplistic approach and is assuming you already have studied C++ for some time. Some pointers and reference types are used almost everywhere in CryEngine. He suggests that having a good understanding of them would benefit you greatly. I followed up with Sunlock, who said, I suggest looking at pure C++ material beforehand to understand the language and what you are doing, since I have found many people that jump into it don't quite get how it works, but try material that is post C++ 11 since the language changed a lot. Basically, no need for using new or delete directly, etc. So I suggest getting familiar with how pointers, etc. work, memory layout, when something allocates memory and how to avoid it, scopes, and RAII, as well as how virtual functions work. Don't really need to dive into template metaprogramming, and when asking for C++ CE docs, the answer is most likely no. Sunlock hammered down to the point of learning C++ in its purest form and then moving to newer versions of C++ to have a good understanding of the language and libraries. He then goes into managing memory, pointers, scopes, virtual functions, and RAII, with something you should learn. He suggests that you don't need to learn template metaprogramming, although from what I have seen, it is heavily used in CryEngine and could prove to be very useful. He then points out that when asking about anything in relation to the documentation for CryEngine, that you aren't likely to find what you are looking for. The documentation is currently being overhauled for the newer version, and there is a lot that needs to be added. Finally, I asked CryFlare, and he had a lot to say on the subject. Please keep in mind that this is not an official statement that should be attached to Crytek or CryEngine as a whole. This is his personal opinion. For C++, you should have at least a basic understanding of the fundamentals of C++. Templates are used for a lot of examples in the internals of the engine, and is very useful when working with different components. As long as you know the C++ syntax and the basics of memory management and templates, you can get pretty far. Aside from this, it really depends on what you want to do. Game logic, for example, just means looking up the interfaces necessary to implement your game logic with certain systems. Example, getting, creating, managing entities and components. For flow graph, you do not need to know any C++. If you want to create a flow graph node yourself, it is relatively simple. You can check out the existing flow graph nodes inside CryFlow system project for examples. The flow graph system is very easy to create new nodes. You can even create them procedurally rather than just at compile time. It does require C++ though, as the flow graph system is not exposed to C# as far as I know. As we can see, CryFlare said a lot, but it is pretty much the same as what everyone else has stated so far. The only difference being he talks about CryEngine specifically. Gee, I wonder why. Notice he goes right into game logic as being the primary concern over graphics. He is specifically avoiding saying anything related to visualization and more with the internal workflow. My personal belief is that you can have the worst graphics in the world but have a solid game loop and people will still enjoy your game. Or conversely, you could have the best graphics ever to be incorporated into a game and a terrible game loop, which would completely destroy the fun factor of the game. Furthermore, he goes into the flow graph system, which is visual scripting in CryEngine. He tells us that we can create our own flow graph nodes with C++ to create our own procedurally or at compile time. This means we could effectively write or have a developer create C++ code to expose as custom nodes, which would allow us to create a game completely within the flow graph system. Finally, he says that we can only do this with C++ because this functionality has not been exposed to the C# side of the engine. This is 100% correct, as I have spoken with the lead C# developer, CryMyron, on this very subject to verify this information. The last person I asked was CryBrian, whom gave me a very in-depth answer to all of the questions. Unfortunately, he has asked to not be quoted in anything that is not in an official capacity. Although, his advice is more along the lines of having decent knowledge in C++ as a whole before learning the CryEngine API. He pretty much said the exact same things that others and I have stated throughout this video essay. There is, however, one last thing he mentioned, and it is something others have not, as many game developers either forget to mention this or fall for this pitfall themselves. Don't be lured by the pretty screenshots of the visual aesthetics, as they are not indicative of good game design. He further went on to say to use basic shapes like cubes, spheres, cylinders, and planes, along with your focus being on the game mechanics. Focus on the game loop itself and perfecting the code until you are confident that it is solid. Lastly, my own personal advice is to be prepared to fail and to fail often. Don't get caught up in trying to be the best or perfect when you are just beginning. Learning a game engine by itself is a monumental task. Adding a programming language to the mix will make your learning suffer, as not only are you learning the basic fundamentals of the programming language, but you are also throwing a custom API into the mix along with the editor and the workflows that are specific to that game engine. I will let you in on a little secret. I am by no means well versed in C++, and I will be creating some basic projects in C++. I will also be following everyone's advice I have gathered for this essay and incorporating my own knowledge from C# and other experiences into my project. Then, I will try to have someone guest star in the video to showcase their own example of the same basic projects that are much more well versed in C++. Then, a full breakdown of both projects will be done, which will include pointing out any mistakes I have made and what can be done to improve. I figure that showcasing that even a seasoned developer can learn new things gracefully and taking criticism of their own work will be a great learning experience for you guys. The series I will be planning based on this video will be Learning C++ with CryEngine, which is counter to the advice I and others have given based on personal experience and opinions, but I know that there are many that will still want to jump into the topic of game development headfirst. So rather than dissuade people from trying to go that route, I have decided that I should instead embrace it and make all the mistakes for others so that they can learn from them. This has been Jesco with Game Dev Made Easy, and don't forget to check me out on Twitter or my Discord server. My community is very happy to talk about any random subject you want to discuss. I am also a frequent purveyor of the official CryEngine Discord server, which is linked as a partner in my Discord server. Link is down below.